What's up, everyone? So glad to be with you all this week. You get to see a different view of my office today, and yes, uh, that is a Frozen poster, so have some fun with that. Today and this week, we're going to be looking at Second Samuel's chapters 15 through 17, which is detailing the beginnings of Absalom's revolt against David and kind of what is happening in the wilderness with David while he's kind of out there. On this note, if you would like some other psalms and things like that, if that would be helpful for your group, I would encourage you to look into Psalm chapter 3 and Psalm 63. Those are both written while David is on the run from his son Absalom. But because this is an expansive 3 chapters, we're not going to read everything. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of go chunk by chunk through this and talk through what's happening, and then we'll look at some of the main points and questions that are going on. So in chapter 15, we pick up right where we left off with the, resolution of Absalom being restored into the kingdom by David, that he's back in good graces. And what's beginning to happen is Absalom has now taken this position of restoration, and he's going to take advantage of it. He begins to go to the city walls every day, into the temple, and he's seeing all these people who are trying to meet with the king, bringing up these, claims that are higher than just kind of local judges and authorities. And he is playing on the same thing that just happened to him. In verse 3, he says, Absalom said to him, "Look, your claims are good and right, but the king does not have anyone to listen to you." He added, "If only someone would appoint me judge in the land, then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice." And when a person approached him to pay homage to him, Absalom reached out his hand and took hold of him and kissed him. Absalom did this to all the Israelites who came to the king for settlement. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And then the next thing that happens is, it says, again, verse 7, if you tell me if you've heard something like this before, it says, when 4 years had passed. So what Absalom is doing is he's playing on David's neglect, the very thing that he had experienced and that his brother and sister had experienced for 7 years prior. He is now going to play on that David is neglectful in this season. For whatever reason, he's not looking into things. He's saying, hey, if only someone like me would be king. If only someone like me could handle your business. But, who's to say what could happen? And then 4 years of this goes by. So he's slowly taking the hearts of the people of Israel. This isn't a momentary thing. This is happening over a long span of time. And eventually, he gathers enough forces, he gathers enough people who are in his confidence, and he starts this rebellion. Verse 11 says, 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom. And then later on, it says that this man named Ahithophel, enjoy saying that one, has gained his confidence, and he's one of David's strongest advisors, if not his strongest, and he's going. So the conspiracy grew strong, and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase. Then an informer came to David and reported, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom, i.e., he's taken the castle. He has taken, everything is done, right? This coup is successful, and David does not want to see bloodshed in Jerusalem. He does not want to fight his son. He does not want to conquer. Even if he could have won, he doesn't want to do that. So David runs. David said to all the servants with him in Jerusalem, "Get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Leave quickly, or he will overtake us quickly. Heap disaster on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." The king's servants said to the king, "Whatever my lord the king decides, we are your servants." Then the king set out, and his entire household followed him. But he left behind 10 concubines to take care of the palace. That's going to come into practice later, right? And as he is leaving, you're seeing the scenes unfold. And verse 23 says that everyone in the countryside was weeping loudly while all the people were marching out of the city. As the king was crossing the Kidron Valley, all the people were marching past on the road that leads to the wilderness. Verse 30, again, keep your ears peeled. It says, David was climbing the slope of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, right? Sorry. David was climbing the slope of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he ascended. His head was covered, and he was walking barefoot, and all the people with him covered their heads and went up with him, weeping as they ascended, right? So in this time, David is making his way out. And before we get to, chapters 15 and 16 are a lot of full of some of the interactions David's going to have, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But in this moment, this is a tragedy, right? This should strike similar chords to what happened with David and Saul, where David is on the run in the wilderness, and he's being hunted. However, it's different this time because in this season, David is the Lord's anointed. He is the Lord's chosen king. And he's been forced from his home. He's on the run. But David's also not alone this time. He has a giant force with him. He has his family. He's, going through this process. But this is a huge grieving tragedy. You see this with all the people weeping. And this is not a good thing. Even though Absalom has done this, right? He is taking action against the Lord's anointed. This is the thing that David refused to do with Saul for so long. He's taking action, and there is wickedness in that, of taking action against who the God has chosen to be king. And then you should hear, the Mount of Olives, and that should strike chords, because that's a place that's going to be really important throughout Jesus's life and throughout Scripture as a whole. That's the place where Jesus would often go and pray. It's the site of some of his most important teachings. It's the starting point of the triumphal entry. It's the place where he's going to be betrayed by Judas. The Garden of Gethsemane is on the Mount of Olives. It's the setting of Jesus' ascension when he tells his disciples, "Hey, I'm going to heaven now. Peace out." Right? And according to Zechariah 14:4, it's potentially the site of Jesus' return. The Mount of Olives is a big deal. And how often was Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, over his people, over the state of things? And now we see David weeping in this moment. However, the Mount of Olives is not just a place of weeping, but it's also the place where the Lord is going to do his work. He's going to redeem things, right? There's already a head looking forward in the grief. But rest of chapters 15 and 16, we see David having a bunch of these random interactions with a lot of different individuals. There's a man named Ittai of Gath who pledges him and his followers support, a huge army that backs him. The priests and the Levites, they throw their support David's way, but David actually sends them back to Jerusalem because he says, hey, if it's God's will that I get restored, then you're going to see me, but this might be part of my judgment and my consequences. So y'all go back, but while you're there, you can act as kind of informants for me. You can be reporters to me. And so David's setting up a little spy system. And then a man named Hushai, comes to David, and David's going to actually send him to be a false advisor for Absalom, right? He's setting up this network. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, brings David a bunch of provisions and kind of lies and tells David that Mephibosheth wanted to stay back, but we'll hear about that a little bit more in a few chapters. And then a man named Shimei starts cursing David and spewing hatred his way, and his commanders want to kill him, and David's like, dog, no, that's not how we do this. And instead is like, hey, his words are as if from the Lord. I'm going to receive his curses as if the Lord is speaking because I deserve judgment. And he's praying that hopefully one day God would restore goodness to David instead of curse and judgment. And so then we finally make our way to, some more text in chapter 16, and we get to this guy, Ahithophel. Again, real fun name to spell, a lot of H's and P's and stuff like that. But it's regarding counsel. In chapter 15, verse 31, David hears of Ahithophel, something like that, whatever, that he has joined Absalom's side, and this is a huge deal. And later on, he's going to say that like the counsel of Ahithophel was like a word from the Lord, right? Like this dude is a good advisor on his side, right? Like this is the guy that you want on side. And it says when he found out that he's joined Absalom's side, David prays to God, Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And we're going to see what happens with that, because Hushai goes over to Absalom, and Absalom's like, aren't you friends with my dad? And he's like, I am on the side of the one that the Lord, this people, and all the men of Israel have chosen. He's getting some real politician words in here, right? I will stay with him. Furthermore, whom will I serve if not his son? As I served in your father's presence, I will also serve in yours. He's using flattering language, but he's never actually committing to Absalom. He's committing to the one that the Lord has chosen, that the people chose and anointed, right? He's committing to David, but he's going to serve his son because that's doing a service to his father, because that's what David asked him to go do. So he's able to kind of play both sides, but Ahithophel immediately gives some wisdom to Absalom. He's like, hey, if you really want to make sure the people know that you are against your father, these 10 concubines that your father left, as good as wives, more, basically go sleep with them. So Absalom goes and sleeps with all of his father's wives and concubines that he left there in the middle of Israel, right? It says they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. And this is fulfilling one of the consequences that Nathan gave to David, that someone was going to have, he was going to have an affair with all of, with David's wives in the sight of Israel in plain day. And this is fulfilling part of that judgment. But later on, Absalom is asking for wisdom and advice, like, hey, what should we do concerning attacking my dad? And Ahithophel gives the advice, like, hey, we should strike hard, strike fast, gather an army, let's go get him while he's on the run. Don't give him a chance to hunker down. And this is good advice. But then Hushai, he's like, hey, what do you think, Hushai? And Hushai is like, that dude doesn't know a thing, right? And he basically contradicts everything that Ahithophel says. He's like, you know your dad. And he's basically using language to make Absalom feel more important, right? Whereas Ahithophel is like, your dad is strong, right? He's giving good advice, but he's making sure that, everyone knows, like, what the deal is. Hushai is like, hey, you're the one. You want to make sure that you are doing all the right things. And he's playing to Absalom's ego. And he's like, hey, like, you don't want to make a mistake. You know your father better than anyone. You know these warriors. Like, this is what you need to do. And gets his ear and allows him to kind of experience this, doubt of Ahithophel. But in verse 14, we read this really interesting verse. It says, since the Lord had decreed that Ahithophel's good advice be undermined in order to bring about Absalom's ruin. Absalom and all the men of Israel said the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than Ahithophel's advice. And it's this crazy thing where we see kind of like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, or the movement of Judas in betraying Jesus, that God is saying, like, I have made it so that Ahithophel's advice is actually going to be seen as bad advice, that you're not going to listen to it in order to bring about Absalom's ruin. And it really brings up these questions of who is at fault here. Is Absalom at fault, or is God, since he's the one who is decreeing these things? God is sovereign, but we have choice and responsibility. And that's a weight in this passage, right? And later on, we see, David's spy network sends word, and they're able to escape. They're able to make their way through. And at the very end of chapter 17, we're reading this just interesting little thing where basically once Ahithophel realizes that his advice hasn't been followed, he knows that things are moving downhill from here. He actually decides to take his own life, most likely because he sees that, like, the writing's on the wall, right? If he's not going to be listened to, he knows that the Lord is against them, and he knows eventually his head is on the chopping block because David's going to come back, and he knows that he helped the coup attempt. And so he actually takes his own life. And while David is in the wilderness, verses 27 and 29 says, when David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, Mashir, son of Amiel, from Lo-Debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, from Rohalim. You're actually going to need to memorize all those. There's going to be a quiz on that this week. That those people brought beds, basins, and pottery items. They also brought wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, goats, and cheese from the herd for David and the people with him to eat. They had reasoned the people must be hungry, exhausted, and thirsty in the wilderness. And this may seem like a weird spot for the chapter to end, for us to end, especially given the past few weeks that we've left on some really sour notes and really rad notes. But this one is just that David and his men are receiving provision. And the important thing that I want us to gain from this is that in David's flight, in David's partially in his consequences and the judgment from the Lord, that God is always faithful to his people, that God is always faithful to the ones he's chose. He is always faithful even when we are faithless. That to David, who has made this huge mistake, who is reaping the consequences of his actions, he's going to provide. He's going to provide materially, right? He's going to make sure that him and his men are well fed. He's going to provide socially and with armies, right? He is bringing him supporters. He's giving him all these random people to act as his informants and spy network. He's constantly providing, and he still has the hearts and the emotions of the people. He's letting David know that these people are still supporting you, and that there are people who care what's happening, and I care. He's actually also providing with Absalom, and blocking his heart from receiving good advice, good counsel, good wisdom, so that David can continue to be blessed as king, right? That even when David was faithless, the Lord is faithful. And that plays into us, that when we are in the wilderness, when we are in our consequences, when we are hurting, God is always faithful. He's always providing. And he continues to do that. And he can't do anything otherwise because he is faithful always. If God was faithless, he wouldn't be God. If he didn't provide, he wouldn't be God, right? Like, that's who he is. And he always provides and always acts in faith. And so as we're looking at some of the big questions that I think we're really going to dive into, the big topics, right? We're a lot going to be looking into like the neglect that David feels, right? And that we're experiencing the consequences of David's sin, right? David has been freed from his sin. He's forgiven, but he's experiencing the consequences still, right? He's had sons die already. He's going to have another one, spoiler alert, die next week. And then he's seeing, his wives being taken. He's seeing the kingdom being threatened. And he's experiencing the practical consequences of his sin, even if he is forgiven eternally. And there's a big balance there, right? Like, how do we balance forgiveness of sin eternally with the practical reality that when we do things, that there is consequence and punishment for them? We're going to look at, this continuing question of, like, if David neglects these things, does Jesus, right? That's a theme that continues, right? And the answer is no. And Jesus displays that through his faithfulness and his provision, especially on the cross. We're going to look at, again, the ties with the Mount of Olives of grief, but also victory, and how that works. There's importance of wise counsel. Why is it important that you surround yourself with people who give you good wisdom and good advice, and why it is detrimental and dangerous to surround yourself with people who give you bad advice? We're going to look at, I think, the question of God's sovereignty is at play here, right? Depending on how your group likes to dive into things, this is a question to go like, man, I mean, Absalom's clearly doing all these bad things and he is at blame, but it is God's will to bring about his ruin. So he is clouding good judgment. So God is acting. God does this with Pharaoh, right? He hardens his heart, so that God can show that he is the one true Lord. Right? And that's in Exodus chapter 7, verse 3-5. See that with Judas, right? Judas makes these actions on his own accord, but he's also fulfilling prophecy. He's also bringing about the thing that God knows has to happen. And all of this kind of goes through, like, who is at fault? And the answer is kind of simple, but also complicated, that we are culpable for our own sins, that we make the choices, we do the things, but at the same time, God is also sovereign and moves things according to his will. And so somehow there is a balance of both of those things. And it might get to the point where you are having to describe and to explain to your students how this is both a good thing and also true and lovely. And the reality is that we have to rest on the fact that God is good, that he loves us, and he has our best intent at heart. But all that to say, the other thing would be, like, I think the big thing to hang your hat on again is God is faithful always, and he always provides. He's always working for our good, for our comfort, for our provision. Even if it doesn't feel like that, God's always with us. That's, for me, why this is a really important section of going, like, God's always with us. In the same way that he was with David, he is always with us, even when it may not feel like that. So that's what I got for us for this week. I'd encourage you to read through all 3 chapters, read through Psalms 3 and 63 as well, kind of dive in and think through your own questions of what is it that your group may need. Think through what are the questions that your group might have? What are the reactions to these things, right? We're, kind of in the midst of this heavy set of chapters, but in this one, you're starting to see glimpses. It's not just that we see Jesus in the contrast, but we see Jesus he's the one that's with us and providing, even when it doesn't feel like that. And I think we all have stories of how that kind of feels. But super excited for this, guys. Love you. Hope you enjoy your study time, and we'll see you on Wednesday.